She hadn't spoken a single word in 3 years. Not to the doctors, not to the nurses, not even to her mother, the woman who had built $1 billion empire from nothing, and yet stood helpless every single night outside her daughter's hospital room door, pressing her forehead against the cold glass and whispering the same question into the silence. "Why won't you talk to me, baby? I'm right here." Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, a little girl who had refused to speak to anyone looked up at a stranger mopping the hallway floor and said 2 words. Just 2. And those 2 words cracked open a story nobody saw coming. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. And when you're done watching, drop a comment and tell me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because you need to understand what was lost before you can understand what was found. The crash happened on a Wednesday. Sienna Ashford remembered that detail with a precision that felt almost cruel. Not the month, not even the exact hour, but the day of the week. Because Wednesday had always been the one afternoon she left work early to pick up Ava herself. Every other day of the week, there was a driver, a schedule, a handoff arranged by her assistant. But Wednesday was hers. That was their time. 40 minutes in the backseat of the car, just the 2 of them, Ava chattering about whatever 6-year-olds chatter about. Her teacher's funny shoes, the boy who kept stealing her eraser, whether clouds were made of cotton candy or regular candy. Sienna had been driving herself that afternoon. No chauffeur, just her and Ava and the radio playing something forgettable. She never saw the other vehicle coming. The police report said it was a black limousine running a red light at nearly 60 miles an hour. The driver was never properly identified. The limousine company dissolved within weeks. There were lawsuits and investigations, and a mountain of legal paperwork that Sienna's attorneys handled while she sat in a hospital waiting room for 11 hours straight, still wearing the blazer she'd had on when the paramedics pulled her out of the wreckage with a broken collarbone and a gash across her forehead that would leave a thin white scar she'd carry the rest of her life. The collarbone healed. The scar faded to almost nothing. Ava didn't walk out of that hospital. The spinal cord injury was incomplete, which the doctors explained meant it wasn't a total severance, which meant there was some theoretical possibility of partial recovery, which meant exactly nothing in practical terms because after 6 months of aggressive inpatient rehabilitation, Ava still couldn't move her legs. After a year, the specialist began using softer language. After 18 months, one of the country's leading neurosurgeons sat across from Sienna in a private consultation room and told her, with genuine regret in his eyes, that she needed to begin adjusting her expectations. Sienna had looked at him for a long moment. "I don't adjust my expectations," she said. "I find different approaches." The surgeon hadn't known what to say to that. Most people didn't when Sienna Ashford was in the room. She was 30 years old. She had founded her first company at 22, a logistics software startup that 3 larger competitors had tried to acquire before she was 25. She had turned them all down, scaled the company herself, and by 28 had been on the cover of 2 business magazines and named to a list of most influential young entrepreneurs in America. The money had come fast and then faster, and Sienna had spent most of it building more. New divisions, new acquisitions. A charitable foundation she'd launched partly out of genuine conviction and partly because her PR team had suggested it, and she'd been surprised to discover she actually cared about it. She had been, by almost any measure, exceptional. And none of it meant anything in the face of her daughter's silence, because that was the other thing the crash had taken. Ava had always been a talker, the kind of child who narrated her own life in real time, who asked questions faster than adults could answer them, who had strong opinions about everything from the color of her bedroom walls to the proper way to eat a sandwich. After the accident, she stopped. Not gradually, not intermittently, completely. The psychologists called it selective mutism, rooted in trauma response. They said it was not uncommon in children who had experienced sudden violent loss of physical ability. They said time and consistent therapeutic support would help. That had been 3 years ago. Ava was 9 now. She communicated through nods and head shakes and occasionally through writing in the small spiral notebook she kept on her lap at all times. She attended school with the help of a full-time aide. She had a tablet with a speech-to-text application the teachers used to draw her into class discussions. She was, her teachers said, clearly intelligent, clearly engaged. She just wouldn't speak. Sienna had hired 4 different child psychologists. She had flown in a specialist from Switzerland who worked exclusively with trauma-related selective mutism in pediatric patients. She had redecorated Ava's bedroom 3 times, trying to create an environment the therapist described as low pressure and emotionally safe. She read every research paper she could find. She attended every therapy session she was permitted to observe. Ava looked at her sometimes with an expression Sienna couldn't fully read. Not hostile, not cold, but carefully contained like a door that had been locked from the inside and the key placed somewhere even Ava herself couldn't reach. The rehabilitation center had been Sienna's latest attempt. Not for the mutism, for the legs. A new facility in Portland, smaller than the university hospitals she'd been using, with a different philosophy. Less clinical, more patient-centered, with a garden courtyard and natural light and therapy rooms that didn't smell like antiseptic. The director, a woman named Dr. Pauline Marsh, had contacted Sienna directly after reading about Ava's case in a medical journal, and had proposed an approach that emphasized neuroplasticity through low-intensity, high-frequency movement stimulus, rather than the more intensive protocols Ava had been through before. Sienna wasn't optimistic. She had stopped being optimistic somewhere around the 14-month mark. But she was still willing to try, and that, she had decided, was its own kind of currency. Not hope exactly, more like the refusal to stop. They had been at the center for 6 weeks when Ava first noticed the man in the hallway. It was a Tuesday afternoon, raining hard outside, the kind of Pacific Northwest rain that came sideways and turned the courtyard garden into a gray blur. Ava was in her wheelchair near the large window at the end of the corridor, waiting for Sienna to finish a call she'd had to step outside to take. The call was with Marcus Webb, her CFO, about a quarterly report that couldn't wait, and Sienna had held up one finger to Ava, 5 minutes, and slipped around the corner with her phone. The corridor was quiet. Most of the afternoon sessions had ended, and the hallway held only the particular stillness of institutional spaces after hours. Distant footsteps, the hum of fluorescent lights, the sound of rain against the glass. Ava was drawing in her notebook. She drew a lot. Not pictures exactly, more like patterns, intricate geometric shapes that spread across pages in careful, deliberate lines. The therapist said it was a positive outlet. Sienna kept every notebook. She heard the voice before she saw where it was coming from. "Okay, bud, left foot first. Don't think about it. Thinking makes it worse. Just move." Ava looked up. Across the hall, in one of the smaller therapy rooms whose door had been left partially open, a man was crouched on the floor next to a boy of maybe 7 or 8, who was balanced at the edge of a low platform, arms out, face tight with the specific kind of concentration that was very close to panic. The man was big, not in a way that was intimidating, but in the way of someone who had spent a long time doing physical work, broad through the shoulders, with forearms that looked like they'd seen use. He was wearing dark pants and a gray facility shirt with a small logo on the chest. His hair was dark, cut short, with some gray starting at the temples. He was watching the boy with an expression that was completely calm and completely focused, the way some people look when they're doing something they understand at a bone-deep level. "I'm gonna fall," the boy said. "You might," the man said. "That's not the same thing as failing. Left foot." The boy moved his left foot 6 inches forward on the platform. He swayed. He grabbed the man's arm. "I got you," the man said. "You moved. That's all we needed." The boy looked up at him, still gripping his arm, and said, "It doesn't feel like anything." "That's fine. It doesn't have to feel like anything yet. Do it again." Ava watched. She had seen physical therapy before, a great deal of it, from the patient side of things, which gave her a particular understanding of what it looked like when someone was going through the motions and what it looked like when something real was happening. She wasn't sure what category this fell into because the man in the gray shirt wasn't a therapist. She had seen all the therapists. He was something else. She'd seen him in the hallways before, moving equipment, checking mechanical things. He had nodded at her once in passing, not with the performative friendliness adults usually directed at children in wheelchairs, but with the same neutral acknowledgement he might have given a colleague. She watched him for a while longer, then she turned back to her notebook. Sienna came around the corner 12 minutes later. The call had run over, half expecting to find Ava asleep in the chair because she sometimes dozed in the afternoons. Instead, she found her daughter sitting very straight, notebook open but not drawing, staring across the hall at a partially open door with an expression Sienna hadn't seen on her face in a long time. Curiosity. "Hey, Bug," Sienna said, keeping her voice easy. "Sorry that ran long. You okay?" Ava nodded. She pointed at the door across the hall. Sienna looked. The room appeared empty now. Whatever had been happening inside had wrapped up. "Did something happen over there?" Ava looked at her for a moment, then down at the notebook. She wrote something and held it up. "Who was that man?" Sienna looked at the empty doorway. "Which man, honey?" Ava wrote again, the one in the gray shirt. Sienna made a mental note to ask at the front desk. "I don't know. Someone who works here, I think. Why?" Ava considered this for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and shook her head slightly, the gesture she used when she'd decided she was done with a topic. Sienna wheeled her toward the exit, into the rain-smelled lobby. She would ask at the desk in the morning. She would find out who the man in the gray shirt was. She had no idea that by the time she did, everything would have already started shifting. His name, the receptionist told her the next morning with mild puzzlement, clearly not understanding why the CEO of Ashford Capital was asking about maintenance staff, was Mason Ryder. He'd been with the facility for 8 months. He was listed as a maintenance supervisor, responsible for equipment upkeep, facility operations, and occasional logistical support during therapy sessions when extra hands were needed. "Does he assist with patients?" Sienna asked. The receptionist hesitated. "Not officially. He sometimes helps with equipment setup. He's good with the kids. Some of the therapists let him sit in. Mostly he's around. Is there a concern?" "No concern," Sienna said. "Thank you." She thought about it for the rest of the morning during a board call that she sat through on autopilot, while her mind kept returning to what Ava had written. Who is that man? It wasn't the question itself. Ava wrote questions sometimes, especially about things she observed. It was the expression that had been on her face, the one Sienna hadn't seen. She asked Dr. Marsh about him over coffee in the director's office that afternoon. Pauline Marsh was a compact, precise woman in her early 50s who had been running rehabilitation programs for 20 years and had very little patience for the kind of softened professional language Sienna had grown accustomed to hearing from specialists. She said what she thought. It was one of the things Sienna liked about her. "Mason," Marsh said, with the slight pause of someone choosing words carefully. "He's unconventional. What I can tell you is that in 8 months, I've had 3 parents mention him specifically. 2 of them said their kids engaged better on the days he happened to be present in the room. The third said her son asked for him by name. He's not a therapist. No, he has no clinical certification." Marsh set down her cup. "I've also watched him work with equipment in the physical therapy room, and the way he spots body mechanics and micro movements is different from what you see in people without specialized training. I don't know his background. I haven't asked." She met Sienna's eyes. "I probably should have." Sienna made a decision the way she usually did, quickly, based on pattern recognition more than deliberate analysis. "I'd like to meet him," she said. The meeting happened that afternoon, in the small break room near the equipment storage area. Mason Ryder arrived 3 minutes early, which told Sienna something. He was in the same gray facility shirt, sleeves pushed up. He was taller than she'd expected. He had the kind of face that was hard to age. There were lines around his eyes that suggested either long exposure to sun and wind or a lot of years of something demanding, and his general manner was completely unhurried, which Sienna found instantly both disarming and slightly annoying because she lived at a pace that most people found exhausting, and this man looked like he could wait out a siege. "Mr. Ryder," she said, "I'm Sienna Ashford. My daughter is Ava." "I know who you are," he said, not dismissively, matter of fact. "I've seen you with her. She noticed you the other day, with a child in the room across the hall." She watched his face. "She asked about you." Something shifted slightly in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration. "I was helping Jake with balance work. He's a patient here. His therapist was running late." "Did anyone ask you to do that?" A beat. "No." "Were you trained to do that?" Another beat, longer. He looked at her with an evenness that she recognized as the look of someone who has decided, in real time, how much to say. "I have some background in physical conditioning and rehabilitation." What kind of background? He was quiet for a moment. Military. Sienna held his gaze. My daughter hasn't spoken in 3 years, Mr. Ryder. She has seen 11 specialists and undergone 4 separate rehabilitation programs. She draws in a notebook and writes notes and hasn't said a word out loud to another human being since she was 6 years old. She paused. Yesterday, for the first time since this crash, she asked about someone. He said nothing. He was listening with the kind of attention that was rare, not waiting for his turn to talk, not forming his response, just actually listening. I'm not asking you to be her therapist, Sienna said. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm asking you to spend some time with her, doing whatever it is you do, and I'm asking you to tell me what you actually see. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. I can't promise you anything, he said. Good, she said. The people who promise me things are usually the ones who don't deliver. He almost smiled. Not quite, but close. I get off at 4, he said. She could meet me in the East Therapy room. 20 minutes. I'm not going to push her. I know, Sienna said, and somehow she did. The East Therapy room had large windows and low equipment, foam platforms, parallel bars at different heights, a handful of balance tools that looked more like children's toys than medical devices. Ava sat in her wheelchair near the window, notebook in hand, watching Mason with the same careful attention she'd turned on him the day before through the gap in the door. He didn't talk to her immediately. He moved a piece of equipment, a low foam cylinder, into the center of the room and sat on it, which put him at roughly her eye level. He had a small rubber therapy ball in one hand. He didn't make a production of it. I'm Mason, he said. You're Ava. She looked at him. You don't have to talk, he said. I've worked with people who couldn't talk. Some of them were the toughest people I've ever known. He turned the ball over in his hands once. I'm not going to tell you what I think you should be doing or what's possible or what the plan is. I'm just going to ask you one thing, and you can write it down or nod or whatever. She waited. Is there a part of your leg you can feel temperature in? Like, if I put something warm or cool against your skin, is there anywhere you can actually feel it? Ava stared at him. Then slowly she raised her right hand and pointed at the outside of her right knee. Good, he said, without any ceremony, without making it a bigger deal than it was. That's something. He stood up, picked up the foam cylinder, and moved it 2 feet to the left. We're going to try one thing, he said, very small, and I need you to focus all your attention on that spot you just showed me, not the rest of your leg, just that one spot. Sienna was watching from the corridor through the long, narrow window set into the door. She had her arms crossed. Her jaw was tight. She had promised herself she would not interfere, and she was keeping that promise through what felt like significant effort. The session lasted 22 minutes. When it ended, Mason walked Ava back to the door himself, pushing her chair. He held the door open, looked at Sienna, and said simply, She has more signal than the reports suggest. Someone should have been looking at that lateral knee region. Sienna stared at him. Have Dr. Marsh checked the most recent nerve conduction study, he said. The area around L3 and L4. The documentation may have missed something. He went back into the room to put away the equipment. He didn't wait for a response. Sienna stood in the hallway, heart doing something unsteady in her chest, and looked down at her daughter. Ava was looking up at her with that same expression, the curious one, the one that had been mostly absent for 3 years. And then, barely above a whisper, so quiet Sienna almost thought she'd imagined it, Ava said 2 words. The first word she had spoken to anyone in 38 months. He's different. Sienna's throat closed completely. She didn't trust herself to speak. She crouched down in front of the wheelchair and just looked at her daughter's face. Really looked. The way she hadn't been able to in a long time because looking too closely had started to feel like another kind of loss. Ava didn't say anything else. She opened her notebook and went back to her patterns. But the door had moved, just slightly, just enough. Dr. Marsh pulled the nerve conduction study the following morning. She called Sienna at 7:43, which was early even by the standards of people who took their work seriously, and her voice had that particular quality of someone who was trying to stay measured while processing something that was genuinely throwing them. The L3-L4 region, Marsh said. There's residual signal. It's weak, but it's there. The original study flagged it as noise, and the follow-up team accepted that interpretation. A pause. It may not have been noise. Sienna was already dressed, already on her second coffee, standing at the window of the hotel suite she'd been renting by the month since they'd come to Portland. The city was gray and damp below her, the way it usually was in November. "What does that mean practically?" she asked. "It means the pathway isn't completely dead. It means there may be more to work with than anyone realized." Another pause, longer. "Sienna, I want to be careful here. I'm not going to tell you this changes everything, because I don't know that yet, but it changes the question." Sienna set down her coffee. "I want Mason Ryder in a room with you and the lead therapist by end of day." There was a brief silence on Marsh's end that Sienna recognized as the sound of a professional trying to figure out how to say something delicate. "He's maintenance staff," Marsh said carefully. "He's the person who found something 11 specialists missed," Sienna said. "I don't care what his badge says." The meeting happened at 4:30 in Marsh's office, which was small enough that the four of them, Marsh, the lead physical therapist, a young woman named Claire Oduya, who had worked with Ava for the past 6 weeks, Mason, and Sienna, made the room feel crowded. Mason arrived last, still in his work clothes, and took the chair nearest the door, which Sienna noticed. People who sat near exits either wanted a quick escape or were accustomed to needing one. Marsh laid out the updated interpretation of the nerve study. Claire had brought Ava's full movement history, 6 weeks of session notes, annotated graphs, video clips from the therapy room cameras. She walked through it with the efficiency of someone who was good at her job and knew it. Mason listened. He didn't interrupt. He asked 2 questions, both specific and technical enough that Claire glanced at him once with an expression that wasn't quite reassessment, but was moving in that direction. When Claire finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "The conventional approach has been to work the major muscle groups first," Mason said. "Build the large systems, see if the smaller ones come online. That's the standard logic, and it makes sense for most injury profiles." He paused. "But Ava's been doing that for 3 years, and the large systems haven't responded. What she has is lateral signal around a narrow band of the right knee. That's not nothing. That's a starting point." "A starting point for what exactly?" Claire asked. Not defensively. She was genuinely asking. "For teaching the brain that the body is still there." He looked at the table. "There's a period after significant spinal injury where the brain essentially stops sending signals to a region because the signals come back as noise or nothing. The brain's efficient. It stops wasting resources on pathways that don't seem to be working. The question is whether you can reestablish communication. Create enough consistent, localized response in a region that still has signal, and sometimes the brain recalibrates." "Sometimes," Marsh said. "Yeah, sometimes." He wasn't trying to sell anything. "I've seen it work and I've seen it not work. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know which category this is." Sienna had been watching him through this whole exchange. There was something almost frustrating about his refusal to oversell. Every other specialist she'd encountered had led with confidence, with data, with carefully constructed optimism, designed to justify the fees and maintain the relationship. Mason was sitting in a borrowed chair in work clothes and telling them that he wasn't sure. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. "What would you need?" she asked. He thought about it. 2 sessions a day instead of 1, morning and late afternoon. The morning session focused purely on the lateral knee work. Very specific, very low intensity, high repetition. Afternoon session in the water tank if the facility has one, because the buoyancy removes the fear factor. She won't feel like she's going to fall. He glanced at Claire. "I'd want to work alongside whoever is running the sessions, not instead of them. I'm not a licensed therapist." "I'm aware," Marsh said with a dryness that had a slight smile underneath it. "What about Ava?" Claire asked. "She has a history of shutting down when sessions get too intensive. We've had to scale back twice already because she disengaged completely." "I know," Mason said. "I'm not going to push her the way the previous programs did. The intensity in what I'm describing is technical, it's not going to feel hard to her. It's going to feel small. That's the point." He paused. "The hardest part of this isn't going to be her body. It's going to be convincing her to keep showing up when nothing seems to be happening, because it's going to look like nothing is happening for a while." The room was quiet again. Sienna looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at Claire. Claire looked at her notes. "I'm willing to try it," Claire said, "if Dr. Marsh approves." Marsh was quiet for a moment longer than seemed comfortable. Then she said, "Unofficially, you're assisting in sessions, Mason. Consultant capacity. We document everything. He nodded. That's fine. And I want weekly check-ins. All four of us. She looked at Sienna. Including you. Obviously, Sienna said. The first 2 weeks were, by any external measure, completely underwhelming. Ava came to the morning sessions with the resigned cooperation of a child who had learned that adults had opinions about her body that she was not particularly able to prevent, and she went through the exercises with a compliance that was not quite engagement. Mason didn't push. He ran the same small sequence of lateral knee work every morning, a series of micro movements, almost imperceptible, focused on the narrow band of signal the study had identified. And he kept the sessions to 40 minutes, and he didn't make a big deal of anything. Sienna watched when she could, and stayed out of it when watching made her too anxious. She had learned over 3 years that her anxiety was contagious. Ava could read it in the set of her mother's shoulders, the specific way Sienna breathed when she was trying not to hope too hard. And so she had developed the discipline of leaving the room and waiting, which cost her something every single time. She spent the waiting time working. There was always work. There was more work than she could ever actually finish, a property of running a company that she had come to accept as structural rather than circumstantial. Her CFO called about the quarterly projections. Her head of acquisitions wanted to discuss a potential deal in the healthcare technology space. Her foundation director had 3 items that needed board approval. She handled it all from the hotel suite and from the coffee shop near the facility and occasionally from the facility lobby, phone pressed to her ear, watching the rain. On the 15th day, Claire texted her at 11:20 in the morning. Can you come in? Sienna was in the lobby in 4 minutes. Claire was in the hallway outside the therapy room, and her expression was the expression of someone who had seen something and was still processing whether to believe it. Tell me, Sienna said. She moved her right foot, Claire said. It was small, an inch maybe, but it wasn't a reflex. She initiated it. She looked at her foot, and then she moved it. Claire paused. Mason saw it first. He didn't react. He reacted, but quietly. He just said, do that again, and she tried, and she couldn't quite repeat it, but she'd done it once. Another pause. Sienna, she initiated voluntary movement in a limb the previous assessment said had no volitional control. Sienna stood in the hallway. She was holding her phone. She realized her hand was not entirely steady. Okay, she said. Okay? She stopped, started again. I don't want to. I'm not going to. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second. Is she still in there? Yes. Can I go in? Claire hesitated. Mason asked me to wait 5 more minutes. He's running a second sequence. He said not to make it into a bigger thing than a Tuesday morning, or she'll freeze. That stopped Sienna completely. She looked at the door. She waited 5 minutes, which was one of the harder things she had done in recent memory. Then Claire opened the door and Sienna went in, and she walked to where Ava was sitting on the low platform, and she sat down on the floor next to her. Not in a chair, on the floor, so she had to look up slightly. And she said, "Morning session done?" Ava nodded. Sienna nodded too. Hungry? We could get lunch. Ava looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something in the notebook and held it up. Can Mason come? Sienna looked over at Mason, who was putting equipment away at the far end of the room and had clearly heard this and was clearly pretending he hadn't. I'll ask him, Sienna said. Well, he came, though he ate like a man who was mildly uncomfortable with restaurants. He scanned the menu for approximately 15 seconds and ordered the first thing that didn't require much explanation, which turned out to be a club sandwich, and he ate it without complaint while Ava had soup and Sienna had coffee and half a salad, and they sat in a booth in the diner 2 blocks from the facility, and outside the rain did what it always did in November in Portland. They didn't talk about the foot. Mason had been clear about that. No direct attention to it yet, because Ava needed to feel like it was hers, not something being observed and documented and celebrated by adults who were invested in a particular outcome. Instead, they talked about other things. Mason asked Ava, without any particular ceremony, whether she'd always drawn those patterns in her notebook or if that was a new thing. She considered him for a moment, then wrote, "Since the hospital." "The hospital where?" She wrote, "After the crash." "Ah." He ate some of his sandwich. "My son draws when he's processing something. He doesn't know that's what he's doing. He just draws. Sienna looked up. She hadn't heard him mention his son before. Ava wrote, "How old is he?" 8. His name is Cole. Mason looked at the notebook. He's been through some stuff. He's tougher than he looks, which is pretty much the case with most 8-year-olds. Sienna set down her coffee. She had done a cursory search on Mason Ryder after their first conversation. She did background research on everyone, it was instinct, and had found very little, which itself was informative. People with ordinary histories left ordinary digital trails. The absence of one usually meant something intentional. "How long have you been at the facility?" she asked. 8 months. Before that? He looked at her with the same calibrating expression he'd used in the break room the first day. "Transition period," he said, which was not really an answer, and they both knew it. "Military?" she said. "Yeah." "How long?" He was quiet for a moment. 14 years. "What branch?" He looked at his sandwich. "Navy." She let it sit there. She wasn't going to push him in front of Ava, and she wasn't sure she needed to anyway. The information she needed about Mason Ryder she was getting in real time. In the therapy room, in the booth of a diner, in the way he talked to her daughter like she was a person with authority over her own experience. Ava tapped the table to get his attention. He looked at her. She wrote something and slid the notebook across. "Why did you leave?" It was the kind of question only a child would ask directly, because adults had learned to approach that kind of territory obliquely. Mason looked at the words for a moment. "My wife got sick," he said. "She needed me home. And then after..." He stopped. Restarted. "Cole needed somebody around, so I got out." Ava held his gaze for a moment. Then she wrote again and slid the notebook back. "I'm sorry about your wife." Mason looked at it. Something moved through his expression, brief and real, the kind of thing that can't be performed. "Thank you," he said. He wasn't performing anything either. "I'm sorry about your dad." The table went quiet. Sienna looked at her hands. She had told Mason briefly, in their second conversation, the basic facts of the accident, the crash, Ava's father, the sequence of losses. She hadn't known he would name it so directly. Ava was looking at the table. Then slowly, she nodded. It wasn't much. But in the language Ava used, the one that had replaced words, it meant something substantial, child. The board call happened 3 days later. Sienna had a standing quarterly call with her executive team and the 4 largest shareholders in Ashford Capital, men and women who had been involved since the early days, who had watched the company grow from a mid-sized logistics software firm into a diversified holding company worth considerably more than any of them had originally projected. They were not unintelligent people. They were, however, people who understood value in specific terms, and they had been growing quietly impatient with Sienna's semi-remote management from Portland over the past 2 months. She took the call in the hotel suite, laptop open, a view of wet rooftops behind her. She had given these calls 1,000 times. She knew how to run them in her sleep. The quarterly numbers were solid, not spectacular, but solid, and the acquisition conversation went smoothly enough. It was near the end of the call, during the period she privately thought of as the ambient concern portion, that Richard Price spoke up. Richard was 63, old enough to have been doing this since before Sienna was born, and he communicated his concerns the way experienced board members did, framed as questions, deniably neutral in tone, with a precision that suggested they had been considered carefully before being voiced. "Sienna," he said, "I want to raise something, and I want to preface it by saying it comes from a place of genuine concern for both you and the company." She knew what was coming. She had known it was coming for about 3 weeks. "Of course," she said. "There are some questions circulating, nothing formal, just conversations, about the degree to which the Portland situation is affecting your availability and focus. We understand the personal circumstances. We respect them. But the perception among certain stakeholders is that key decisions are being delegated in ways that wouldn't normally be the case, and that some of those decisions are..." He paused. "I'll say it plainly. People are asking why the rehabilitation approach for Ava has been restructured around input from a maintenance worker." The other faces on the call were carefully neutral. "His name is Mason Ryder," Sienna said. "I understand that. The concern isn't personal to the individual. It's about the judgment being applied. There are world-class specialists, We've had 11 world-class specialists, she said, over 3 years. In that time, not one of them identified residual nerve signal in the L3-L4 region that has now been confirmed by a revised electromyography study to indicate the presence of volitional motor potential. She kept her voice level. Mason Ryder identified that in 20 minutes. Another pause. We understand he has some military background, Richard started. He spent 14 years in the Navy. I don't know his full record because he hasn't shared it and I haven't pressed him, but the level of expertise he's demonstrated in identifying and designing around a spinal injury profile that stymied multiple board-certified neurologists suggests it is considerably more specialized than his current job title implies. She looked at the camera. I want to be clear about something. The decisions I make about my daughter's care are not board decisions. They're not subject to shareholder input, and if there is a perception issue stemming from those decisions, I will manage it. What I will not do is remove this one person who has produced a measurable result because the optics are inconvenient. The call ended on professional terms. They always did. Afterward, Sienna sat in the suite for a few minutes without doing anything. The room was quiet, and the rain had finally stopped, and a pale, unconvincing sunlight was trying to make something of the late afternoon. She thought about what Richard had said. A maintenance worker. As though the title was the person, as though everything relevant about Mason Ryder was contained in those 2 words on a facility badge. She had done this herself once, reduced people to their legible function, their visible role. She had been building a company, and there were efficient ways to process information about people, and she had used them. She wasn't sure exactly when she had stopped. Cole Ryder was 8 years old and had his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, which were a light hazel that looked almost gold in certain light, and he had been brought to the rehabilitation center twice now after school on days when Mason's schedule ran long, and the aftercare program Cole normally went to had closed early. He sat in the hallway with his backpack and his own homework and didn't complain about it, which Sienna suspected was a practiced patience rather than a natural one, the kind children developed when their circumstances required it. He and Ava had encountered each other for the first time on a Thursday afternoon when Sienna had been in the facility longer than expected. Cole was in the hallway reading a book. Ava came through in her wheelchair on the way back from the water therapy session with Claire, hair damp, looking tired. Cole had looked up and said, matter-of-factly, "Is the water tank warm or cold?" Ava blinked. She was accustomed to children either staring at the wheelchair or very deliberately not staring at the wheelchair. The question bypassed the whole apparatus. She held up a hand and made an ambiguous gesture. So. I figured, he said. They always say warm and then it's medium. She looked at him for a moment, then took out her notebook and wrote, "What are you reading?" He held it up. It was a book about shipwrecks. She looked at it, then she wrote, "Any good?" "Yeah, there's one chapter about a ship that sank in Alaska in like 1906. They were out there for 3 days on this freezing rock before anybody found them." He turned the book over in his hands. "My dad told me about it. He knows about a lot of stuff like that." Ava wrote, "Your dad was in the Navy." "Yeah, he doesn't talk about it a lot." Cole shrugged, with the practiced nonchalance of a boy who had learned to accept what adults chose not to share. "But sometimes he tells me about survival stuff. How to stay warm. How to stay calm when things are bad." Another shrug, smaller. "He says the most important thing is not to panic, because panicking uses up the energy you need for the thing that actually gets you out." Sienna, who had come around the corner and stopped when she saw them talking, stayed around the corner. Ava wrote something in the notebook. Held it up. From where Sienna stood, she couldn't read it, but she saw Cole read it and then look up and say, "He says the same thing about that the body follows what you tell it, not the other way around." Ava looked at the words she'd written. Then she closed the notebook. She didn't write anything else, but she stayed there in the hallway talking to Cole, through the notebook, through gestures, through the developing shorthand of 2 children who communicated differently but were willing to work at it, for another 20 minutes, until Mason came out of the equipment room and found them there and stood in the hallway looking at his son and at Ava with an expression that was quiet and difficult to name. He caught Sienna's eye across the hallway. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. But she saw something in his face, not quite surprise, more like the look of a man who had learned to hold the things he hoped for carefully, at a distance, because holding them too close had cost him before. And she understood it, because she had been carrying exactly the same posture for 3 years. The toes moved on a Friday. It happened at the end of the morning session in the 4th week during a sequence. Ava had done so many times she'd stopped thinking consciously about it, which Mason had said was the point, that voluntary movement was sometimes easiest to reach when the conscious mind stepped back and let the body remember something it hadn't been allowed to attempt. Ava was sitting on the low platform, eyes closed the way Mason had shown her, not meditating, nothing like that, just removing one input channel so she could focus on another. And she was doing the breathing pattern and directing attention to the band around her right knee. Mason was 4 feet away, not touching her, not coaching actively, just present. Claire was in the corner making notes. And then Ava's right foot moved. Not the small single-inch initiation from 2 weeks ago. The foot moved, and then the toes followed. A distinct, separate, voluntary flex of the toes, small but unmistakable. The kind of movement that is unambiguously intentional when you've been watching bodies closely for a long time. Claire made a sound that was not quite a word. Mason said quietly, "Stay with it. Don't open your eyes yet." Ava stayed still. Her face was doing something complicated, the kind of internal event that was too large for expression, that was moving through her faster than her features could keep up with. "Can you do it again?" Mason said. A pause. A long one. Then the toes flexed again. Both feet this time, right and then left, as if the signal had found a secondary route. Ava opened her eyes. She looked at her feet. She looked at Mason. I was looking back at her with the most composed face she had ever seen on an adult in this context, which was the only reason she didn't fall apart immediately. Because he was treating it like something real, but not like a miracle, like a development, like a thing that had happened because the work had built toward it, like a Tuesday, which was exactly what he'd said from the beginning. "There it is," he said. Just that. Ava looked at her feet again. Then she looked at Claire, who had given up entirely on maintaining professional composure and had her hand over her mouth. Then Ava reached for her notebook. She wrote something and held it up. "Don't tell my mom yet." Mason read it. "Why?" She wrote, "I want to walk to her. When I can. I want to walk to her." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "We'll work toward that." He looked at Claire, who nodded, still not entirely trusting her voice. It would be another 11 days before Sienna found out. 11 days during which Ava came to every session with something that had not been there before. Not optimism exactly, because she was 9 years old and had been through enough to be appropriately skeptical of optimism. But purpose. A reason to show up that belonged entirely to her. Mason kept his word. He didn't tell Sienna. He had spent 14 years keeping operational information confidential under conditions considerably more pressured than this. And this was the one secret he'd been asked to keep that had made him feel, in a way he couldn't have articulated precisely, like the work was worth something beyond the clinical outcome. He drove home those evenings to the small house he rented 20 minutes from the facility, made dinner for Cole, helped with homework, and sat in the kitchen afterward with a cup of coffee that went cold. While he stared at the table and thought about a girl who wanted to walk to her mother under her own power, and about how much that specific desire, the desire to arrive somewhere on your own terms, was something he understood better than most. Cole came into the kitchen one night around 9 and found him there. "You're doing the staring thing," Cole said. "What staring thing?" "The one where you look at the table like it said something rude." Mason looked up at him. "Go to bed. It's 9:15. 9:15 is bedtime." Cole went to the fridge, extracted a glass of milk that had already been poured and was waiting there, which meant he'd been planning this specific delay, and leaned against the counter. "Is Ava getting better?" Mason looked at him. "I'm not stupid," Cole said. "You come home different on the days her sessions go well." Mason was quiet for a moment. Cole was 8 and had his mother's perceptiveness, which had always been both a gift and a thing that occasionally caught Mason off guard, even now, 2 years after she'd been gone. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." Cole drank his milk. "Good," he said, with the simple finality of a child who has said the thing that needed to be said and considers the matter handled. He rinsed the glass, put it in the drying rack, and went to bed. Mason sat in the kitchen a while longer. The house was quiet. Outside, for the first time in what felt like weeks, there was no rain. Just a clear, cold November night and a sky with stars in it, which in Portland felt like a specific kind of announcement. He finished his cold coffee. Ava was going to walk. He didn't know exactly when, and he wasn't going to promise it to anyone, but he knew it the way he had known certain things in the field. Not from data, but from the accumulation of small signals that added up to a direction. The body was relearning the conversation it had forgotten how to have. The pathways were rebuilding themselves in the patient, unhurried way that the body did things when it was actually healing rather than being forced. He just had to keep showing up. And so did she. That had always been the whole of it, really. You showed up, and you kept showing up, and somewhere in the repetition of that, the impossible became just another Tuesday. The 11 days passed the way certain periods of waiting do, slowly in real time and, in retrospect, almost without duration, as though the mind had quietly agreed to compress them into something manageable. Sienna knew something had shifted. She wasn't certain what, exactly. There was nothing she could point to directly, no visible evidence, no dramatic change in the therapy room reports that Claire filed each week. But she had spent 3 years learning to read Ava at a distance, the way you learn to read weather through a window you can't open. And there was something different in the set of her daughter's shoulders during the morning sessions. Something in the way Ava arrived at the facility each day that was less resigned and more present, deliberate, like someone who had a destination in mind. She didn't ask. She had learned that asking too directly was its own kind of pressure, the kind that could close a door that had only just come open. So she watched, and she waited, and she filled the waiting with work and with the specific, disciplined patience she had developed over 3 years of learning that the alternative to patience was despair, and despair was not something she could afford. On the 11th day, Ava asked if Cole could come to the afternoon session. She wrote it in the notebook at breakfast and passed it across the table to Sienna, who read it and said, without inflection, "I can ask Mason if that's okay with him." Ava nodded and went back to her toast. Mason said yes. He said it without hesitation, which told Sienna it wasn't a surprise to him, which meant Ava had planned this, had known what she was going to ask and when, which meant the afternoon session was something specific, something prepared. Sienna understood she was being managed by a 9-year-old, and she respected it more than she could say. Cole arrived at 3:30 with his backpack and his shipwreck book and an energy bar he'd been saving, and he went immediately to Ava in the hallway and sat on the floor next to her wheelchair and showed her the chapter he'd been reading about the 1906 wreck in Alaska, which he had now finished and had strong opinions about. Ava read a passage he pointed to and wrote something in response. They were still arguing about some detail of the rescue protocol. Through Ava's notebook, back and forth, when Mason came out of the equipment room and looked at his son and then at Sienna with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of being moved. "Afternoon session in 10, he said. Cole looked up. "Can I watch?" Mason looked at Ava. Ava wrote, "Yes." Then she added, below it, "You have to be quiet." "I'm always quiet," Cole said. Ava raised an eyebrow at him. He reconsidered. "I can be quiet," he amended. She accepted this with a nod, and they went into the therapy room, which had been arranged slightly differently than usual. The parallel bars moved closer to the center, a clear path of about 8 feet between them, the low platform pushed to one side. Sienna noticed the arrangement from the doorway. She processed what it implied and felt something move through her chest that was not quite hope and not quite fear, and was probably both of them occurring simultaneously, which was a condition she had inhabited so long she had stopped trying to separate them. "You can come in," Mason said. She stepped inside. He closed the door behind her and turned to face the room. Claire was in the corner near the window. Cole had settled himself against the wall with his knees drawn up, already demonstrating the promised quiet. Ava was positioned at one end of the parallel bars, her hands resting in her lap, looking at the bars with an expression that was completely unreadable to everyone in the room, except possibly Mason, who had watched her face through enough sessions to understand its particular vocabulary. "You want to tell her?" Mason asked Ava. Ava looked at Sienna. Then she picked up the notebook and wrote, slowly and deliberately, and held it up. "I've been practicing. I didn't tell you because I wanted it to be real first. It's real now. I want you to watch." Sienna read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor, the same way she had in the therapy room weeks ago. Not in a chair, on the floor. So she wouldn't be above Ava, wouldn't be looking down at her. She couldn't speak. She nodded. Ava set the notebook down. She gripped the parallel bars, one on each side, the handles worn smooth, and she pushed. The effort in her arms was immediate and visible, the muscles in her small forearms standing out, and she rose. Not all the way, not cleanly. She went up and then dropped back twice before she got her weight distributed, and her legs came underneath her. She was standing, bent, shaking, not the upright posture she would build toward over the weeks ahead, but standing, with her weight distributed between her own feet and the bars and nothing else. Cole made a sound against the wall that he suppressed immediately. Sienna pressed both hands over her mouth. Ava looked at the far end of the bars. 8 feet. She had told Mason once, in the notebook, that 8 feet felt like the moon. He had written back. He'd started writing back sometimes, in her notebook, when he wanted to say something without speaking. The moon is a fixed distance. 8 feet is a decision. She moved her right foot. It was slow. It was effortful in a way that was almost painful to watch, not because it was agonizing, but because the concentration required was total, the kind that reduces a face to pure intention, and Ava's face was doing exactly that. She moved her right foot 6 inches forward. Then she moved her left. The bars held her when she swayed. She let them. Mason stood at the far end of the bars, 7.5 feet away, and he did not move toward her and he did not speak. He just watched with the full, steady attention she had come to rely on, the specific quality of someone who was present without exerting pressure, which was rarer than it sounded. 3 steps. 4. She stopped at the halfway point and her arms were shaking and her breathing was audible. "Take a break," Mason said. "Don't sit down. Just pause." She paused. She breathed. Sienna, on the floor at the end of the room, was not breathing at all, or barely, and Claire had stopped writing anything, and Cole had his hands pressed flat on his thighs, the way his father sometimes held himself still, when stillness was the appropriate response. Then Ava moved again. Step 5 was the worst. Her left knee buckled and she caught herself on the bars with a small sound that was not quite a cry, and for a moment she just hung there, suspended between going forward and going down. Mason said quietly, "Your body follows the courage in your heart. You've got plenty of both." It wasn't a rousing speech. It was just words, said plainly, in the tone of someone stating a fact. That was what made it reach her. She pushed herself upright again. Step 6, step 7. And then she was at the end of the bars, and Mason was 1 foot away from her, and she looked up at him from beneath the enormous effort of having done this thing she had decided she was going to do, and he held out his hands, not grabbing her, not catching her, just offering. And she let go of the bars and stepped forward, and he caught her. She buried her face in his shoulder, and her whole body shook, and she did not make a sound. He held her the way you hold someone who has just done something that cost everything they had, firmly, without comment, without ceremony. His eyes were closed. His jaw was tight in the way of a person who is keeping something internal that wants very much to be external. Sienna was on the floor with both hands over her face, and her shoulders were shaking, and she was making no sound either. Cole had abandoned all pretense of composure and had both arms wrapped around his own knees and his face turned away from the room. Claire walked to the corner and faced the window and did not come back for a full minute. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Ava pulled back from Mason's shoulder and looked at him, and he looked at her. And she reached back for his hand without looking, found it, and turned around. And she walked, slowly, unevenly, one hand still in his, the 3 steps across the room to where her mother was sitting on the floor. Sienna reached up for her, and Ava came down to her, and they held each other on the floor of the therapy room, and Sienna said, into her daughter's hair, the only words she could find, "I'm right here, I'm right here." Ava held on. The story should have ended there. Private, contained, belonging only to the people in that room on that Thursday afternoon in December. 6 weeks of work, 1 result, 1 family. Putting itself back together in the quiet of a small therapy room with the rain hitting the windows and a boy against the wall trying not to cry and a man standing back to give them the space they needed. But it didn't end there, because nothing that matters ever ends exactly where it should. The Ashford Foundation's annual gala had been on the calendar for 8 months. It was the foundation's largest fundraising event of the year. 400 guests, a hotel ballroom in downtown Portland, and a program that Sienna's foundation director had been building since September. It raised money for medical research and pediatric care programs, and a scholarship initiative that Sienna had started 3 years ago, at the worst point of that first winter, partly because doing something constructive was the only antidote she'd found to the particular helplessness of watching her daughter not get better. She had planned to attend alone, to make her remarks, thank the donors, present the grant recipients, and leave. She had done this every year. It was a performance she was good at. She knew exactly how much of herself to show in those rooms and exactly how much to protect. 3 days before the event, Ava found her at the kitchen table in the hotel suite, laptop open, rehearsing notes. She slid the notebook across. "I want to come." Sienna looked at her. "To the gala?" Ava nodded. "It's going to be a lot of people, Bug. Cameras, press." Ava wrote again. "I know, I want to come." A pause, then below it. "Can Mason bring Cole?" Sienna held her daughter's gaze for a moment. "I'll ask him," she said. She asked him the next morning, in the break room, in the same 2 chairs they'd used the first time they'd spoken. He had a coffee he wasn't drinking. She had water she kept turning in her hands. "It's a fundraiser," she said, "for the foundation. 400 people. Press." She paused. "Ava wants to come. She asked specifically if you and Cole could be there." Mason looked at his coffee. "I'm not asking you to perform anything," she said. "I'm not going to put you in front of cameras or ask you to give a speech. She asked, and I said I would ask." "What does Ava want to do at a fundraiser?" he said. "I think she wants to walk." He went still. "I think," Sienna said carefully, "that she has a plan. I haven't asked her directly because I know better, but she's been in the therapy room every morning this week on her own with Claire, running the bars, and she asked me twice how many steps it is from the edge of the stage to the podium." Mason absorbed this. "It's 32 steps," Sienna said. "We measured." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Between them was the shared knowledge that 32 steps was an enormous ask for someone who had walked 8 feet for the first time 4 days ago, and also the shared understanding that neither of them had any standing to make that decision for Ava. "If she tries it in that room," he said, "in front of 400 people, and she goes down, that's a different experience than going down in here. The stakes are different. The audience changes what it costs." "I know." "Does she know?" "I think she knows better than either of us," Sienna said. "She spent 3 years not being able to move. She understands what public failure feels like. She's been through it in front of doctors and therapists and specialists who wrote their conclusions in journals." She paused. "I think she's choosing the terms." Mason was quiet for a long time. "I don't catch her," he said finally. "If she wants to do this, she does it. I stand at the end and I'm there if she needs me, but I don't catch her automatically. She has to know the difference." "I know." "She needs to know that too." "Tell her," Sienna said. "She'll listen to you." Something passed across his face at that. Brief, ambiguous, the reaction of a man who was still adjusting to being the person someone listened to after whatever years had passed during which that had not been the shape of his life. "Cole doesn't have anything to wear to a gala," he said. "I'll handle that," Sienna said. "Sienna." "It's not a thing. Don't make it a thing." He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. "Okay," he said. "What?" The gala was on a Saturday evening in the 3rd week of December, and Portland had, in a meteorological coincidence that felt almost theatrical, produced a clear night, cold and sharp, with a sky that was actually dark rather than the ambient orange-gray of cloud cover, and stars that were visible above the hotel's lit entrance, where guests arrived in cars and stepped out onto a red carpet that Sienna had never authorized, but which her foundation director had quietly added to the program on the grounds that it photographed better. Sienna arrived first, with Ava in the wheelchair. Ava was in a dark green dress that she had picked herself and dark tights, and her hair was down, which she rarely wore it. She was quiet in the car, but her hands were still, which was how Sienna knew she was not afraid. When Ava was afraid, her hands were always moving, tapping her notebook, folding and unfolding the corner of a page. Still hands meant settled decision. Mason and Cole arrived 20 minutes later, and Cole was in a blazer that fit him almost correctly and had his hair combed in a way that suggested either effort or supervision, and he found Ava near the entrance immediately and said something to her that made her look down at her notebook and write something back that made him laugh. And the sound of it was so ordinary and unguarded in the middle of all those dressed-up adults carrying drinks that several people nearby turned to look. The ballroom was large and warm and loud, with the specific noise of 400 people in an enclosed space, the accumulated sound of conversations and cutlery, and the string quartet near the far wall. Sienna worked the room the way she always did, efficiently, genuinely, with the cultivated ability to make each conversation feel like it mattered, even when she was running a mental parallel process on 17 other things simultaneously. She introduced Mason briefly to the three people who asked who he was, saying only that he worked with her daughter's rehabilitation program, which was true, and said nothing, and Mason was aggressively normal about it. Shook hands, said a few words, moved on, did not appear to find the gilded room either impressive or uncomfortable, which impressed Sienna more than she expected. Richard Price was there. He found Sienna near the bar at the 40-minute mark, which was earlier than she'd expected, and handed her a glass of sparkling water without being asked. He had known her long enough to know she didn't drink at these events. "She looks well," he said, nodding toward Ava, who was across the room with Cole, the two of them examining the centerpiece on one of the tables with the focused interest of children evaluating something's potential. "She is," Sienna said. Richard was quiet for a moment. "The quarterly numbers are better than I made them sound on the call. I want you to know I'm aware of that." She looked at him. "I was making an argument," he said. "It wasn't my best one." This was as close to an apology as Richard Price generally got. Sienna accepted it in the spirit it was offered. "The approach with Mason Ryder is working," she said. "I expect it to continue working." "I gathered," he said. "I also did some research." He paused, turning his glass. "His service record. The Navy doesn't publish much, but enough comes through if you know where to look. He was a SEAL, Sienna, 14 years, decorated multiple times. The rehabilitation work he did with wounded operators. Apparently he more or less developed an approach that became unofficial protocol in certain programs." He paused. "The man knows what he's doing." "I knew that in the first 20 minutes, Sienna said. "I know you did." He looked across the room at Mason, who was talking to one of the Foundation's grant recipients, a pediatric physical therapist from Seattle who was gesturing animatedly about something. "I'm slower than you. Always have been." He almost smiled. "It's why you're the CEO and I'm a board member." Sienna looked at him. "You're a very good board member, Richard." "Don't flatter me. Go check on your daughter." She went. The program began at 8. The Foundation director made introductions. The grant recipients were announced and came forward to receive their awards, and a short video played about the programs the Foundation had funded over the past year. Images of children in therapy rooms, families in waiting rooms, a clinic in rural Oregon that the Foundation had helped equip. The ballroom had the particular hush that large rooms develop when something real is being presented rather than performed. Sienna made her remarks at 8:45. She kept them short. She thanked the donors and the Foundation staff and the medical teams. She talked about the principle behind the Foundation, that access to quality rehabilitation care should not depend on what a family could afford. She did not talk about Ava. She almost never talked about Ava in these rooms, because Ava's situation was Ava's, not a narrative device for fundraising, and she had made that boundary early and kept it. She stepped back from the podium. And then Ava's voice came through the microphone, which Claire was holding for her at the edge of the stage, and which Ava had walked to, from the wings, with the wheelchair left behind, while the room was still processing the end of Sienna's remarks. The room noticed before it fully understood what it was noticing. The string quartet stopped. Ava's voice, when it came, was small and not entirely steady because she had not used it for public speaking in 3 years, and because she was 9 years old, and because the lights were very bright and the room was very large. But it was her voice, and it was words, and the room heard them. "My name is Ava Ashford," she said. 3 weeks ago I walked for the first time since I was 6. Complete silence. She was holding the edge of a chair someone had placed at the stage lip for exactly this contingency. Mason's contingency planning, invisible but present. She was standing with her weight forward, the way he had taught her. "My mom built this foundation to help kids like me," she said. "I wanted to tell you it works. Because of the people she finds..." She stopped. Her voice had gone slightly unsteady, and she waited it out, which was a thing Sienna had never seen a 9-year-old do. Just wait out an emotion instead of being derailed by it, because of the people she finds, and the people who show up, and the people who don't give up. She looked at the room. That's all I wanted to say. She handed the microphone back to Claire, and then she let go of the chair. Sienna was at the side of the stage, off to the left, and she saw this happening, and she understood in the same moment what was about to happen. She felt Mason appear beside her, and he put his hand on her arm, not restraining her, just present. And she understood that too. The room understood something was happening, but not yet what. 400 people in the collective held breath of an audience that senses a moment without being able to name it. Ava was at the edge of the stage, looking out at the room, and then she stepped down to the floor. One step, then two. The stage was low, and there were 2 shallow stairs. And she was on the ballroom floor, and the distance between her and Sienna was 20 feet, and Ava began to walk it. The steps were not smooth. They were effortful and slow, and her arms came out for balance twice, and she stopped once at the 10-foot mark and stood still for 2 full seconds. And the room was so quiet you could hear the heating system, and then she kept going. Someone in the back of the room made a sound. Then someone else. By the time Ava had covered 15 feet, the sound in the room had built into something layered and uncontrolled. Not applause yet, something more involuntary than applause. The collective response of 400 people witnessing something that was defiantly, inconveniently human in a way that broke through the formal occasion like a window breaking. She almost went down at 18 feet. Her left knee buckled, the same one that had given way in the therapy room, and she swayed hard to the right, and there was an audible intake from the crowd, and Sienna stepped forward, and Mason's hand tightened on her arm, and she stopped. Because Ava had caught herself, had found her balance, had stood back up, and was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who is furious at themselves and is going to use that fury as fuel. She walked the last 2 feet. She walked into Sienna's arms, and Sienna held her, and the room came apart. The applause was not the polished fundraiser applause of people performing appreciation. It was the other kind, disorganized, prolonged, the kind that has no agenda because the people doing it have temporarily forgotten they're at an event. Several people were crying in ways they probably hadn't anticipated when they'd gotten dressed that evening. Richard Price, near the back, was looking at the ceiling in the specific way of a man who is not going to cry in a ballroom if it kills him. Cole, standing next to the cocktail table where he'd been for the past 20 minutes, said, to no one in particular, "I knew she was going to do it." Mason heard this and said nothing, but the thing that happened in his face was not nothing. Well, the cameras were there. They were always there at these events. The foundation's own photographer, a journalist from the local paper who covered the charity circuit, 2 guests who had been filming casually on their phones when Ava started walking and had kept filming. The images and the video were on social media within minutes, which meant they were everywhere within an hour, which meant that by the time Sienna and Ava were in the car heading back to the hotel, Sienna's phone was doing something it did during genuine news cycles, ringing continuously, notifications stacking faster than they could be cleared, her assistant's number appearing 3 times in 5 minutes. She silenced it. Ava was asleep against her shoulder before they reached the hotel. Completely, instantly asleep. The way children fall asleep after total physical and emotional expenditure, with no transition, just a sudden and absolute departure from consciousness. Sienna sat in the back of the car with her daughter's weight against her shoulder and the city going by outside the windows, and her phone vibrating in her hand. She didn't answer it. She looked at Ava's face, at the thin scar along her jawline from the crash, at the small, specific weight of her, the solidness of her, 9 years old and stubborn and strategic and brave in a way that had no template because she had invented it herself out of necessity. She thought about the man who had found the door and shown her daughter how to open it. She thought about what it meant to show up. Not once, not dramatically, but every morning, in a gray facility shirt, with full attention and no performance and nothing to sell. She thought about Mason in the ballroom, standing slightly to the side of everything, watching Ava walk toward her mother with the expression of someone who was completing a thing he had committed to completing and was not going to make it about himself for even a moment. She thought about Cole saying, "I knew she was going to do it." She thought about all of this and looked at her daughter's sleeping face and felt the particular quality of an evening that had become a marker, the kind of night that divides time into before and after, that you will measure other things against for the rest of your life. The car turned. The hotel appeared ahead. Sienna's phone went dark in her hand. Outside, the December sky was clear and very cold and full of stars that had been there all along, waiting for the cloud cover to lift. The video ran 47 seconds. Someone had captured it from the left side of the ballroom, a guest with a phone, decent angle, surprisingly steady, and it showed Ava from the moment she let go of the chair at the stage edge to the moment she walked into Sienna's arms. 47 seconds of a 9-year-old girl crossing 20 feet of ballroom floor on legs that 3 years of medical consensus had declared permanently non-functional. The near fall at 18 feet was in there. The recovery was in there. The last 2 steps were in there. By Sunday morning, it had 4 million views. By Sunday evening, it had 14. By Monday, it was on every major news network, introduced with varying degrees of accuracy about the backstory and a consistent inability to identify who Mason Ryder was, which was how his name entered the public conversation, as a question. The man standing at the side of the stage. The man Ava had walked toward. The man who appeared in the background of every shot, not moving, not reaching for her, just watching with an expression that several commentators described in the slightly overheated language of viral news cycles as the calmest face in the room. Who is he? Sienna's communications director called at 6 Monday morning. His name was Derek Foss, 34, and he had worked for her for 3 years and was very good at his job, which mostly involved managing the gap between what was true and what people were going to say regardless. "You need to get ahead of this," he said. "The speculation is already running. I've got 3 separate threads claiming he's a physical therapist she hired secretly, one claiming he's a family friend, and one that somehow landed on the idea that he's a former professional athlete. None of them are right." "I know," Sienna said. "If his background comes out through someone else's reporting, it's a different story than if it comes from you." "The SEAL angle." He paused. "Sienna, that's a significant narrative. Decorated veteran working as a maintenance supervisor identifies what specialists missed, teaches a paralyzed child to walk. That's not a story that stays quiet." "I know that too. So what do you want to do?" She was at the window again. Hotel suite, 7th floor, Portland gray outside going on 4 months now. Ava was still asleep in the bedroom. She could hear nothing from the room, which meant the deep sleep of total exhaustion, which was fine. More than fine. "Nothing today," she said. "Give me until tomorrow." The press request, hold them, all of them, tomorrow. She hung up and stood at the window and thought about Mason, who did not have a communications director, and whose phone she suspected had been ringing since Sunday morning, and who had said, in every conversation they'd had, in which the topic of attention came up, almost nothing, in the manner of someone who had developed a practiced relationship with staying out of frame. She called him. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been awake. "I figured it would be you," he said. "Your phone?" "Yeah." A pause. "I turned it off last night. Turned it back on this morning. There are a lot of messages." "I know. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. It's my foundation's event." Ava walked into a room full of people of her own free will, he said. "Nobody made that happen. Don't apologize for it." She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a second. Then she said, "My communications director wants to put together a statement, something that gives the press a factual version before they build their own. It would include you, your background." She paused. "I'm not going to do anything without your permission." The silence on his end was longer than usual. She could hear what might have been coffee being poured. "What does that look like?" he said. "I don't know yet. That depends on what you're willing to have said." Another pause. "My service record isn't classified. The broad strokes are public record if someone looks hard enough. Some of it..." He stopped. "Some of it I'd rather not have turned into content." "I understand that." "Do you?" It wasn't hostile. It was a genuine question, the kind that had weight behind it, the kind asked by someone who had good reason to wonder whether the people around them actually understood the things they claimed to. "No," she said after a moment. "Probably not fully. But I'm asking, which is different from assuming." He was quiet again. "Tell your director to draft something minimal," he said. "Service branch, years served, general area of expertise. Nothing specific. I'll look at it before anything goes out." "Of course." "And Sienna?" His voice had changed slightly, lower, more careful. Cole goes to school. I need his school to stay out of this. Done, she said. Absolutely done. I'll have Derek make that explicit in every conversation with every outlet. Okay. Are you... She stopped herself. Am I what? I was going to ask if you were okay, and then I realized that was probably an annoying question. A beat. Then something that might have been the edge of a laugh. Little bit, yeah, he paused. I'm fine. It's loud, but I've been in louder. She believed him. She'd been learning to read which things he said were performance and which weren't, and this was the second category. Come in Thursday, she said. Session is normal. Ava's going to need normal more than anything else right now. Yeah, he said. I know. Well, the statement went out Tuesday morning. Derek had drafted it cleanly, and Mason had read it and removed 2 sentences and approved the rest, and it was accurate and spare and gave the press just enough to stop inventing. Navy veteran, 14 years of service, specialized rehabilitation work with wounded service members, currently consulting on Ava Ashford's recovery program. 2 paragraphs. No quotes from Mason. A quote from Dr. Marsh, who had been briefed and who said, in the measured language of a director who had learned to be precise, Mr. Ryder's contribution to Ava's progress has been significant, and his methodology is grounded in serious expertise. We are fortunate to have had his involvement. The press did what the press did. They built outward from the frame they'd been given, found former colleagues and unit members who said, in carefully nonspecific terms, that Mason Ryder had been exceptional, that the rehabilitation work he'd done with wounded operators was unlike anything conventional military medicine had produced, that he was exactly the kind of person who would do something like this, and exactly the kind of person who would not want to talk about it. One retired Navy captain, reached by a journalist from a national paper, said only, I've known Mason Ryder for 15 years. If he tells you a child can walk, you better clear a path. That quote ran everywhere. The public response was the kind that forms quickly around the right story at the right moment. Enormous, emotional, and slightly overwhelming to everyone at its center. Sienna's foundation received $43,000 in donations in the 48 hours following the statement. 3 hospitals reached out to ask about Mason's methodology. A rehabilitation advocacy group requested a meeting. Derek, who had been in communications for 12 years, told Sienna on Wednesday that he had never seen organic response to a non-crisis story move this fast. Sienna processed all of it from the hotel suite and from the car and from the facility's small conference room when Marsh needed her, and she kept a wall between it and Ava with the same focused intention she brought to everything that mattered, absolutely, without apology. Ava went back to sessions Thursday morning as though the previous Saturday had been a Tuesday, which was more or less what Mason had aimed for. She walked into the facility on her own feet, with a cane on her left side that she was not happy about, but had accepted as a practical necessity for the next few weeks, and she went into the therapy room and worked for 40 minutes, and came out tired and didn't complain. The cane was a particular sore point. She had written about it at breakfast, pushing the notebook across to Sienna with an expression of distinct displeasure. It makes me look like an old lady. Sienna had looked at it. It makes you look like someone who walked 20 feet in front of 400 people last Saturday, she said, which is what you are. Ava had taken the notebook back and written something else and showed it. It still makes me look like an old lady. They had both, at that point, laughed, a real laugh, the kind that catches you, and the sound of it in the hotel suite had been so unfamiliar and so correct simultaneously that Sienna had had to look at the ceiling for a second. It was the first time they had laughed together in longer than she could accurately remember. Mason came to find her Thursday afternoon after the session. Sienna was in the small conference room with Derek on a call, and Mason waited in the hallway until the call ended, which she saw through the glass panel in the door, and which told her it wasn't urgent. He'd learned over the months when to interrupt and when to wait, and the calibration was good. She came out and he handed her a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. It was a printed email, a long one, from an organization called the Harmon Institute, a nonprofit focused on pediatric and veteran rehabilitation research. The email was addressed to Mason directly and had been sent to an address she hadn't known he had, which meant someone had found it. It was a detailed, serious inquiry about whether he would consider a consulting role developing a nationwide program. combining neuroplasticity-based rehabilitation with resilience training, targeting both disabled children and wounded veterans. The institute had funding. They had facilities. They had a board with names she recognized. She read it twice. "When did this come?" she said. "Monday. I didn't see it until yesterday." He had his hands in his pockets. "There are 3 others like it, different organizations." She looked at him. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet." He leaned against the wall. I didn't do this to start a career." "I know that." "I did it because Ava needed someone to look at her differently." He paused. "That's the whole of it." "I know that too." She folded the email again. "But that doesn't mean this isn't also an opportunity to do it for other kids. A lot of other kids." He looked at the opposite wall. "Cole's school is here. His whole life is here. Portland has hospitals. The Institute has a regional office on the West Coast." She paused. "I'm not pushing you. I'm just saying the geography might be more flexible than it looks." He looked at her. The hallway was quiet. Late afternoon, most of the sessions done. The facility settling into its end-of-day quiet. "My foundation is looking at expanding its rehabilitation programming," she said. "We've been talking about it for 6 months. The gala was supposed to be the fundraising push to get that started." She kept her voice level, matter of fact. "I would want someone to lead it who understands both sides, pediatric recovery and veteran care. Someone who can build a methodology rather than just consult on an existing one." "Sienna, I'm not offering you a job. I'm telling you what my foundation needs." She met his gaze. "Those are different statements." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of processing something he hadn't expected. Not surprise exactly, more like the careful evaluation of someone who had learned to check the ground before stepping. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking." He picked up the folded email from where she'd placed it on the conference room ledge, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and went back down the hallway to finish something in the equipment room. She watched him go and thought about the particular difficulty of offering something to a person who had built a self-sufficient life as a deliberate strategy. The way they processed generosity differently than other people did. The way it landed adjacent to the wound it was trying to address, rather than directly on it. She had been doing that herself for years. She recognized the architecture. Cole found out about the attention, the way children find out about most things, through the ambient noise of other children at school, which was considerably less filtered than adult communication and considerably faster. By Tuesday of that week, 2 kids in his class had shown him the video on their phones during lunch. By Wednesday, his teacher had gently asked if things were okay at home, in the way teachers do when they're not sure what they're navigating. By Thursday, he had arrived at the facility after school with a quality of suppressed agitation that Mason read in about 30 seconds. He sent Cole to find Ava, which was his standard approach to Cole's specific agitation. Give him something concrete to do, someone to talk to. Let the energy find a productive channel. Cole went. Ava was in the garden room near the big window, notebook open, drawing the geometric patterns she still kept up even as her words had steadily expanded over the past weeks. Mason heard them from the hallway. "It's weird," Cole said. "People keep talking about my dad like they know him." Ava wrote something. Cole read it. "Yeah, but they don't know him. They know the video version." She wrote again. "I know that's how it works. It's still weird." A pause. "One kid said my dad was famous and I should be proud. And I am proud. But he's just my dad. He's the guy who burns the grilled cheese every time and makes me redo my math homework if I rush it." Sienna, who had come to the garden room from the other direction and was now also in the hallway, stopped. She heard Ava's pen moving, then Cole, reading, "Yeah, he doesn't talk about the Navy stuff." A pause. "He said once that a lot of what happened over there belonged to the people who were there, and it wasn't his to share with everyone." A shorter pause. "I think some of it is stuff he doesn't want me to know yet, because I'm 8. Sienna and Mason were both in the hallway now, a few feet apart, both listening. "My mom told me before she got sick," Cole continued in the tone of someone relaying something they've carried a long time, "that my dad was the kind of person who carried everyone else's weight so they could keep going. She said it was his best thing and his hardest thing at the same time." He stopped. "I didn't totally understand that when I was 6. I think I understand it better now." Mason had gone very still in the hallway. Sienna looked at him. His jaw was working. He was looking at the floor. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on his arm, briefly, lightly, the touch of someone acknowledging rather than comforting. And then she moved away down the corridor and gave him the hallway. The meeting with the Harmon Institute happened in the second week of January in a conference room at their Portland regional office. A modest space, not trying to impress, which Sienna had noted as a positive signal about an organization. The Institute's director was a woman named Dr. Yolanda Ferris, 60, with a direct manner and a research background in neurological rehabilitation that meant she and Mason spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting essentially evaluating each other's expertise before either of them discussed the actual proposal. Sienna sat to the side and let this happen. She had learned when to be the driver and when to be the passenger, and this was the second situation. Ferris laid out the program concept: a national network of integrated rehabilitation centers, each one designed around the principle Mason had been applying with Ava, combining medical neuroplasticity protocols with resilience-based conditioning, serving both pediatric patients and wounded veterans, with a sliding scale access model so that families without significant resources could participate. The funding was substantial. The timeline was aggressive but not impossible. The Institute wanted someone to develop the clinical methodology and train the practitioners who would implement it. Mason asked questions that Sienna knew he already knew the answers to because she had seen him read the Institute's research papers. She'd found the pages he'd printed in the therapy room. And the questions were the kind that test whether an organization's public position matches what they actually think when pushed. Ferris answered without hesitation and without gloss. After an hour, Mason sat back and said, "What happens to the children who don't respond? What's the support structure when the protocol doesn't work?" Ferris looked at him steadily. "We're building that into the program design. It's not afterthought." "It usually is," he said. "I know. That's why I'm telling you it won't be here, but you'd have to trust me on that, and I understand if you don't yet." Mason looked at the table, then at Sienna, briefly, then at Ferris. "The pay structure your email mentioned," he said. "I need it to be conditional. If the program doesn't reach the access targets, the sliding scale families, the veterans without private insurance, I want that tied into my compensation, not a penalty, a condition. The outcome has to matter." Ferris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been running this institute for 9 years. No one has ever walked into this room and made that kind of request. Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It's the opposite of a problem." They worked out the framework over the next 2 hours. Sienna's foundation would serve as a funding partner for the pilot program. 3 regional centers, Portland being the first. Mason would lead methodology development, training, and the veteran rehabilitation component specifically. Claire Oduya, who had been approached separately and had said she would go wherever the work was meaningful, would lead the pediatric clinical side. Dr. Marsh would serve in an advisory capacity. By the time they came out of the building, it was late afternoon and the January cold had teeth in it, and Mason stood on the sidewalk outside looking at nothing in particular for a moment. "You okay?" Sienna said. "That's not an annoying question this time," he said. "Good, because I'm asking it." He put his hands in his pockets. "The last time I had a mission that felt like it mattered this much, I was—" He stopped, reconsidered whatever he'd been about to say. "It's been a while since something lined up right." "For me too," she said. They stood on the sidewalk in the January cold, and the city moved around them the way cities do, indifferent and constant. And after a moment he said, "I need to pick Cole up from his after-school program by 5:30. "I know. Go." He went. She stood there another moment and watched the city and felt the particular quality of a decision that had just been made, one of those slow-building choices that looks sudden from the outside, but has actually been accumulating for months in the form of small moments and careful observations, and the gradual, reluctant revision of a position you'd held so long you'd stopped examining it. She had built her life on the premise that she was the one who could be trusted to solve things, that the application of sufficient intelligence and resources and will could address any problem, that the limitation in any given situation was never the approach but the effort. She had built a billion-dollar company on this premise. She had also spent 3 years applying it to Ava and running into a wall she couldn't will her way through, and the wall had been, as it turned out, not a problem of resources or effort or intelligence, but of perspective. She had been looking at her daughter's situation from inside the framework of loss, and what Ava had needed was someone who looked at it from inside the framework of possibility. Mason had done that, not because he was exceptional, though he was, but because he had walked into the situation without the weight of the previous 3 years. He hadn't known what everyone had decided was impossible. He had just looked at what was there. She thought about that a lot, the particular value of someone who doesn't know what can't be done. She thought about it on the drive back to the hotel, and while Ava showed her a drawing she'd made that afternoon, and while they ate dinner and while she sat at the kitchen table afterward with her laptop, doing the things that needed doing, which were never finished. She thought about it, and then she closed the laptop earlier than usual and went and sat on the edge of Ava's bed the way she used to when Ava was small, before the accident, and Ava was reading, an actual book, held in both hands, her legs under the covers. And Ava looked up. "Tired?" Ava said. Her voice, over the weeks since the gala, had been returning to you steadily, not always and not with everyone, but more each day, in the incremental way of something that had been stored rather than lost. "Little bit," Sienna said. Ava looked at her for a moment with the particular assessment of a child who has spent years reading adults carefully. "Good tired or bad tired?" "Good," Sienna said. "Definitely good." Ava considered this and appeared satisfied. She went back to her book. Sienna stayed on the edge of the bed, not doing anything, just being in the room, which was a thing she had not allowed herself very often, because being in the room without a purpose had always felt like a failure of productivity, and she was only now beginning to understand that presence was its own form of work, maybe the most important kind. She sat there until Ava fell asleep. Then she turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment in the habit she'd had since Ava was an infant, the checking habit, the making sure habit, the one that had survived everything and that she suspected she would carry the rest of her life. Ava was breathing. Ava was here. Ava's legs were under the covers, and those legs had walked 20 feet in a ballroom 5 days ago and would walk further tomorrow and further still the day after that. Sienna turned off the hallway light and went to the window, the same window she had stood at for 4 months, and looked at the city. For the first time in a long time, it didn't look like a holding pattern. It just looked like where she was. Mason told Cole about the new position on a Sunday, which was pancake morning, the one tradition they had maintained with absolute consistency since Cole was 4, regardless of location or circumstance. Mason made the pancakes badly, in the sense that they were never the same twice, and were sometimes more like very thick crepes and occasionally had burned edges. But Cole had grown up on them and had strong opinions about the correct ratio of syrup to pancake surface area, and the ritual of it was more important than the execution. He put the plate in front of Cole and sat across from him and said, without preamble, "I'm going to be doing different work starting next month. Not at the facility. I'll be helping set up a program for kids like Ava and for veterans who need rehabilitation." Cole looked at his pancakes. He poured the syrup with the calculation of a person who takes this seriously. "Are we moving?" "No, Portland, same house, same school." Cole nodded, visibly relaxing. "Will you still work with Ava?" "Differently. She'll be part of the pilot program." Cole cut a piece of pancake, ate it. "Does she know?" "Her mom knows. They'll talk to Ava." "She'll be happy," Cole said, with the confidence of someone who had spent enough time with Ava to understand her character. "She likes being part of things." He paused, fork in hand. "She told me once, in the notebook, that the worst part about the wheelchair wasn't the legs. It was that everyone acted like she was watching instead of participating." Mason looked at his son. Cole ate another piece of pancake, apparently unaware that this observation had just detonated something quiet and significant in the room. "When did she tell you that?" Mason said. "A while ago, like in November maybe." Cole shrugged. "She says stuff in the notebook she doesn't say out loud. I think it's easier." He looked up at his father. "Why?" Mason shook his head slowly. "Nothing. It's just, you pay attention. You always say that's important." "It is." Cole returned to his pancakes. Mason sat across from him in the Sunday morning kitchen of the house that had been temporary for 8 months, and was starting to feel like somewhere, with the smell of coffee and burned pancake edges and the specific quiet of a winter morning with nowhere to be immediately. And he let himself have the moment, not analyzing it, not planning past it, just sitting inside it, which was a thing he had been practicing with mixed results for 2 years and was slowly getting better at. Cole looked up. "Dad?" "Yeah." "I'm glad we came to Portland." Mason looked at him, at the hazel eyes that were his mother's, and the stubborn jaw that was something else entirely, and the 8-year-old face that held both the child he'd been and the person he was becoming, with the particular transparency of someone who hadn't yet learned to arrange their expression for an audience. "Yeah," Mason said. "Me too." He meant it in ways he couldn't have fully enumerated, in the way of the work, and in the way of Ava, and in the way of Cole sitting across from him eating pancakes on a Sunday in a city that was cold and rainy and had turned out, against all planning, to be exactly where they needed to be. He poured himself more coffee. Outside, for the 4th morning in a row, the Portland sky was doing something unusual and somewhat suspicious. It was clear. The pilot program opened in March. Not with a ribbon cutting or a press event. Mason had been explicit about that, and Sienna had agreed without argument, because she understood by now the difference between what needed to be public and what needed to be protected from the weight of attention in its early stages. The first day was quiet deliberately. 8 patients, 4 pediatric and 4 veterans, 2 therapists per patient, a small staff of practitioners who had spent 6 weeks in training sessions that Mason had run with the focused intensity of someone who understood that what he was transferring wasn't just technique, but a way of thinking about the body and the person inside it. Claire was there. Dr. Marsh came for the first morning and stayed 4 hours longer than she'd planned. Ferris arrived from the Harmon Institute with 2 members of her research team who would be documenting outcomes for the longitudinal study the Institute was building around the program's data. Ava was there too, not as a patient this time, but because she had asked to come and Sienna had brought her, and she sat in the observation area with her notebook and watched the first sessions with the particular attention of someone who understood from the inside what was happening in the room. She wasn't drawing patterns. She was writing actual notes, observations, questions, things she wanted to ask later. Her handwriting had gotten larger and more certain over the months, which her occupational therapist said was consistent with overall neurological stabilization and which Sienna thought was probably also just Ava deciding she was done being tentative. The cane was gone by February. She still favored her right side and her gait had a quality. Her physical therapist described as a work in progress, which was accurate and also fine, because work in progress was not the same as stopped. She wore it without self-consciousness, the slight unevenness, the occasional catch in her left step, the way you wear something that is part of your honest history rather than something to be concealed. After the first morning session ended and the patients had gone to rest, Mason came to the observation area and sat down next to Ava. He looked tired, not depleted, but the particular tiredness of someone who had been running at full concentration for hours. "What did you write?" he said, nodding at the notebook. She considered him for a moment, then passed it across. He read through several pages, slowly. His expression shifted a few times, something like recognition, something like surprise. "You noticed the woman in Bay 2 was compensating with her left shoulder," he said. "It's what I did," Ava said, "when I was first trying to use the bars. I didn't want to seem like I wasn't trying, so I moved the parts that worked too much to cover for the parts that didn't." He looked at her. She was 10 now, had turned 10 in February, a birthday party that had been small and specific and included Cole and 3 friends from school and a cake she had decorated herself with geometric patterns and blue frosting, which was very Ava. She had the directness that serious children develop when they've spent time around adults who didn't manage reality for them, the kind of directness that was occasionally startling and consistently useful. "You should tell Claire," he said, "about the shoulder compensation. She'll want to know." "I was going to." He handed the notebook back. They sat in the observation room while the second session set up below them, and the winter light came through the high windows, and the program that had started as a maintenance supervisor noticing something in a corridor ran its second hour of its first day. Well, spring came late that year, or maybe it just felt that way because the months between January and April had been so dense with building, the program, the staffing, the second regional location in Seattle, that the Harmon Institute moved on faster than anyone had projected, because the Portland data was already producing outcomes that Ferris described, in her cautious research director language, as exceeding preliminary models. What Ferris meant, translated, The approach was working in ways that were difficult to explain within the existing frameworks, which meant the frameworks needed revision, which was the most significant thing a rehabilitation program could produce. Mason didn't read the research papers about his own methodology. He read the clinical notes. He read the session documentation. He was in the Portland Center 4 days a week and developing the Seattle program remotely, and he was doing it with the same quality of attention he'd brought to the therapy room at the facility. Total, unperformative, focused on the thing in front of him rather than the architecture around it. He was also, Sienna noticed, sleeping better. She knew this because they had fallen into a pattern, not planned, accumulated, of talking in the evenings. Not every evening, but many. Sometimes it started as a practical call about the program and ran long. Sometimes she texted about something Cole had said to Ava that day, because Cole and Ava had developed a friendship that operated in its own register and produced observations that both parents found alternately baffling and illuminating. Sometimes one of them just called because the day had been long and there was something to say to someone who understood the context without requiring explanation. It wasn't nothing. They both knew it wasn't nothing, and neither of them named it directly, which was the approach of two people who had been through enough to be careful with things that mattered. There was no moment of declaration, no scene from a movie. There was instead a gradual and mutual dropping of the specific posture they both carried. The self-sufficiency performed as identity. The I'm fine that had become structural rather than occasional. Sienna was the one who eventually said something, in the way she did most things that mattered, directly, without significant preamble. It was an April evening, and they were sitting on the back porch of a house she had rented in Portland. She had stopped living in the hotel in February, because 4 months was enough to understand that this was not temporary. And it was the first genuinely warm evening of the year, the kind that shows up in the Pacific Northwest with an almost aggressive pleasantness after 5 months of gray. And Cole and Ava were in the backyard arguing about something that involved a stick and a set of rules that appeared to be invented in real time. "I keep waiting for this to feel like something I should slow down on," she said. Mason had a coffee. He was watching Cole explain something to Ava with the focused inaccuracy of an 8-year-old who was certain he was right. "Meaning?" "Meaning you. This." She gestured slightly. "I keep waiting to feel like it's moving too fast or the timing's wrong or there's some reason to hold back." He didn't say anything. "I'm not good at this," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I run a company and I'm good at that. I make decisions under pressure and I'm good at that. Personal. This kind of personal, where I'm actually showing someone what's there without the protective layer. I'm not practiced at it." She looked at him. "Marcus, my CFO, has told me for years that I use work as a perimeter. He's not wrong." Mason looked at the yard. "I built a life designed for 2 people, and then it became a life designed for 1.5, he said. "Cole and I figured out our version. It works. But I got so accustomed to it working that I stopped. I stopped leaving room for anything that might change the balance, because the balance is what's keeping us okay." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to change the balance. I'm just telling you what's true for me, and I'm leaving it there." He looked at her. "I'm not a decision you have to make tonight," she said. "I'm just someone who's telling you the truth because I'm tired of the alternative." He was quiet for a long time. In the yard, Ava had taken the stick away from Cole and was demonstrating something, and Cole had the expression of a person who disagrees but is choosing their battles. "My wife's name was Rachel," Mason said. Sienna went still. "She was funnier than me. Significantly. She could make anyone laugh. Strangers, people who didn't want to like her, Cole when he was in a full meltdown at 3 in the morning. He looked at his coffee. "She died in April, 3 years ago. It was fast, which they said was a mercy, and I still don't know how to categorize that." He stopped. "For the first year, I was so deep in keeping Cole functional that I didn't have the capacity to be anything other than his father. And then the second year, I started to come up for air and realized I had no idea who I was going to be next. The Navy was gone. Rachel was gone. The rehabilitation work I'd built there was gone." He paused. "Portland was... I took this job because Cole's aunt lives here and I needed proximity to family for his sake, and I figured I'd figure the rest out." "Did you?" Sienna said. "Some of it." He looked at her directly. "Some of it I'm still working on." She held his gaze. Outside, Cole had reclaimed the stick and Ava had sat down in the grass in the way she sometimes did now, choosing the ground, choosing to be low, which was its own kind of arrival from someone who had spent years unable to make that choice, and was watching him with the patient expression of someone who has decided to let the other person be wrong for a while. "I'm not asking you to be ready," Sienna said. "I'm asking you to not leave because you think it's the responsible thing to do." He almost said something, stopped, then, "Rachel used to say I pre-grieve things, that I'd decide something was going to go wrong and start protecting myself from it before it had a chance to be anything. Smart woman." "Yeah." A pause. "She was." They sat there on the porch in the first warm evening of the year, and the city hummed around them with its specific Pacific Northwest sound, which was quieter than most cities and always slightly wet, even on dry days. And after a while, Mason set down his coffee and said, "I'm not leaving." 3 words. No architecture around them. Just the 3 words said in the same tone he used for things he meant completely. Sienna looked at the yard. "Okay," she said. The first annual gala of the Ryder Ashford Rehabilitation Initiative, which was the official name of the combined program, a compromise between Ferris's institutional naming conventions and Sienna's preference for something that didn't sound like a hedge fund, took place the following December, 1 year to the month after Ava had walked across a ballroom floor. The event was in the same hotel. This had been Ava's idea, communicated to Sienna in the notebook, and then, when Sienna asked her to explain it to the event director directly, communicated in words, which she did with the slightly impatient clarity of someone who had a vision and needed the adults to keep up. "Because it matters that it's the same place," Ava said to the event director, who was nodding and writing things down. "The same room is part of the story. If you change the room, you change what it means." The event director wrote "same venue," Ava's rec in her notes, and moved on. The program had, in 12 months, treated 63 patients across the Portland and Seattle centers, 31 children, 32 veterans. Of those, 47 had shown measurable gains in voluntary motor function beyond what their intake assessments had projected. 12 had returned to activities their pre-program prognosis had ruled out. 3 had been featured in a research paper that Ferris's team published in January, which had circulated widely in rehabilitation medicine circles, and produced a level of professional interest that was beginning to change the conversation in ways that would take years to fully register. Mason had presented the methodology at 2 medical conferences, both times with the same quality of directness he brought to everything. No inflation, no hedging, clear about what was demonstrated and clear about what remained uncertain. Both times he had been approached afterward by practitioners who wanted to train in the program, which was a problem they were actively solving by scaling the training infrastructure. None of this was smooth. None of it was without friction. There had been a funding gap in August that had required Sienna to make 3 difficult calls and redirect a portion of the foundation's capital reserves in a way that Richard Price had described as aggressive, and she had described as necessary, and they had gone back and forth about it for a week before he had conceded the point, which was how their board relationship generally operated. There had been a conflict between Claire and one of the Harmon Institute's senior researchers about documentation protocols that had required 2 mediation sessions and a policy revision. There had been a week in September when Mason had been running on 4 hours of sleep for 5 consecutive days and had said something in a staff meeting that was sharper than it needed to be and had gone back and apologized in person to the person it had landed on because that was the kind of person he was. He got it wrong sometimes, and then he fixed it, without theater and without excessive self-flagellation. Sienna had watched this particular sequence and had felt something that she eventually identified, with some surprise, as relief. Not at the mistake, but at the repair. At the evidence that he was a person who operated in the actual world, with actual failures, and dealt with them in a way that was sustainable rather than performed. She had thought about this a lot over the year, about what it meant to build something with someone who was honest about their limitations, about the particular freedom of not having to be exceptional all the time in order to be valued. She had been trying to give Ava this lesson her whole life without knowing how to demonstrate it. It turned out the demonstration was the lesson. The night of the gala, Ava got dressed in the hotel room they'd kept for the evening and emerged in a dark blue dress that she had picked herself and shoes with a small heel that she had also picked herself and that her physical therapist had signed off on after a test walk, and she stood in the doorway of the bathroom while Sienna was still doing her own hair and said, "I'm going to speak tonight." Sienna met her eyes in the mirror. "I know." I wrote it out. Ava held up 3 pages of the notebook, dense with her larger, certain handwriting. "It's not a speech exactly. It's more like what I actually think." "Can I read it?" Ava considered. "After." She lowered the pages. "I want to say it first. Then you can read it." Sienna looked at her daughter in the mirror. 10 years old, standing in heeled shoes in the doorway of a hotel bathroom, 3 pages of handwritten words under her arm, the thin scar along her jaw and the slight asymmetry of her stance and the absolutely unambiguous resolution in her face, and she thought, "There is nothing I did that made her this. This was in her the whole time. All I did was stay." Which was, she understood now, the whole of it, the whole job. Not fixing, not solving, not applying resources to problems until they yielded. Just staying, just being present in the room, in the car, on the floor of the therapy room, on the porch in the first warm evening of the year. She had spent so long believing that presence without action was passivity. She had confused the two so thoroughly that she'd almost missed what her daughter needed most, which was not another specialist or another protocol, but a mother who would sit on the floor and wait, and still be there when the door opened. She had been learning this slowly, the way adults learn the things that matter, through experience, through error, through the occasional grace of someone else's example. She thought about Mason, who had walked into a rehabilitation facility as a maintenance supervisor, and had looked at a child everyone had given up on and had simply, stubbornly, refused to accept the conclusions that had been handed to him. Not because he was a hero, not because he was extraordinary, though he was, but because he had been paying attention to the body, to the signal, to the small and overlooked evidence that something was still there. She thought about what it meant that the people who changed things were so often the ones nobody had accounted for. The ones in the wrong job title, the wrong room, the wrong category for the situation at hand. The maintenance supervisor with 14 years of military rehabilitation expertise. The 9-year-old who decided she was going to walk to her mother. The CFO who burned the bridges, and the board member who admitted he was slow, and the research director who built the safety net into the design instead of the afterthought. None of them had been the expected person for the thing they did. Maybe that was the whole point. The ballroom was the same chandeliers, same dimensions, same entry point from the left wing where the stage connected to the floor. 460 guests this time, 60 more than last year, because the program had grown and the donor base had grown, and the story had continued to spread in the organic, unmanageable way of things that are real rather than manufactured. Richard Price was there. He found Mason near the entrance and shook his hand and said without preamble, "I owe you an apology from about 14 months ago." Mason looked at him. "I made a comment on a board call," Richard said, "about your job title. It was a proxy for a different argument I was making, and it was dismissive and it was wrong." "I heard about that," Mason said. "I assumed as much." Richard held his gaze. "I'm sorry." Mason looked at him for a moment with the evaluating expression, and then he said, "I've had people underestimate me my whole life. It's never stopped me from doing anything." "I know," Richard said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," Mason agreed. "It doesn't." He paused. "Apology accepted." Richard nodded and moved on, which was how he did most things. Mason watched him go and turned back to the room, where Cole was already somewhere near the food, with the focused purpose of an 8-year-old who has identified his priority. Sienna appeared at Mason's elbow. She had a sparkling water, and she handed him a coffee, which she had learned to bring him at events because he otherwise didn't drink anything for 3 hours, and ran on empty, which made him quieter and sharper-edged than was ideal for extended social situations. He took it. "Thank you. Thank you. Ava's backstage," she said. "She's calm. Calmer than me." "She's always calmer than you." "I know. It's a character flaw in one of us." He almost smiled. "She's going to be fine." "I know she is." Sienna looked at the room. "I'm fine too. This is the anniversary of the thing that started everything, and I'm aware of that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Last year at this point in the evening, I was standing about 15 feet to your left trying to figure out if I'd made the right call, letting Ava make that choice." "Had you?" "Yes. But I didn't know that until she made it." He sipped the coffee. "That's the part nobody tells you. You make the call, and then you find out if it was right. In that order. Sienna thought about this. That's terrifying. Yeah, also just how it works. She looked at him. He was in a jacket that fit him correctly. Cole had told her 3 weeks ago that they'd gone shopping together for it, and that his dad had tried on 4 before deciding they all looked the same. And Cole had finally pointed at one and said, "That one, we're done with the exhausted finality of a shopping companion who has reached his limit." And Mason had bought that one without further deliberation. She had found this story unreasonably endearing and had kept that to herself. The program began. The grant recipients. The research presentation. A short video from the Seattle Center. A veteran in his 40s, former Marine, demonstrating a range of motion in his right arm that his intake documentation had classified as non-restorable, talking to the camera with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who has stopped being surprised by what the body can do when given the right conditions. The room was quiet in the particular way of an audience that is paying actual attention. Then Ava came out. She walked from the wing onto the stage without assistance, in the heeled shoes, with her 3 pages of notebook paper in her hand, and she went to the microphone and stood in front of 460 people who had watched the video of this same girl crossing this same room's floor 12 months ago. And the cumulative recognition in the audience was audible, a sound like a large room breathing in. She looked at her pages. Then she set them down on the podium and looked at the room instead. "I'm not going to read this," she said. "I was going to, but I'll just say it." In the wings, Claire pressed her hand over her mouth. Mason and Sienna were at the side of the room, standing close enough that their arms were touching, watching. "1 year ago, I walked across this floor for the first time in 3 years, Ava said. "I've thought a lot about what I want to say about that because people keep asking me what it felt like and I never know how to answer." She looked at the table nearest her, where an older couple sat who had been donors since the foundation's first year, and then out at the wider room. "I think what I want to say is this. The hardest part wasn't the legs. The legs were the thing everyone could see. The hardest part was the 3 years I spent believing that what everyone said was impossible was just the truth. That's what they kept telling me, and I kept hearing it. And after a while, I started to build my life inside what was possible instead of what might become possible." She paused. "Mason never told me I was going to walk. I want to say that clearly because I've seen some of the articles and some of them say that he believed in me, and that made the difference. And that's sort of true, but it's not the whole thing. What he actually said was that there was more signal than anyone had measured. That's it. That's what he told my mom. There was more signal." She looked at her hands on the podium. "He wasn't asking me to believe in the impossible. He was asking me to believe in what was actually there." The room was completely silent. I think that's the thing. I think we tell people, especially kids who are going through something hard, we tell them to hope. We tell them to believe. And hope is good. I'm not against hope. But hope by itself is it's just a feeling. What Mason gave me wasn't a feeling. It was a different way of measuring what was real. She looked up. He looked at me and saw more than the last 3 years of reports said was there. And then he showed me how to look at myself the same way. Sienna was looking at the floor. Her jaw was working. Beside her, Mason was very still. "The program we're here to support tonight helps people who have been told what isn't possible," Ava said. "I've met some of them. I've sat in the observation room and watched their sessions, and some days it's hard to watch because I remember exactly what that feels like from the inside, how slow it is, how much it hurts to try and not get there, how easy it is to decide the reports were right." She looked at the room one more time. "They weren't right about me. And I'm standing here because one person looked past them, and because my mom didn't stop, and because sometimes the most important thing isn't a miracle. It's just someone who keeps showing up and sees you more accurately than you see yourself." She picked up her 3 pages. "That's it. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you for being here." She walked off the stage. The room came apart the same way it had last year, not in the organized applause of a formal event, but in the unmanaged response of people who have been reached somewhere they didn't plan to be reached. The applause mixed with the sounds of people who have been in rooms like this for years and have learned the difference between a presentation and something true. Sienna was already at the wing when Ava came off the stage, and Ava walked directly to her, and they held each other the way they had in the therapy room 11 months ago, when none of this existed yet. Firmly, without words, in the language of two people who had been in the same story for a long time and knew exactly what the other one had been carrying. After a moment, Ava pulled back and looked at Mason, who was 2 feet away. "How was that?" she said. "Honest," he said. She considered this. Good honest or bad honest? "There's only one kind," he said. She thought about it, then nodded, accepting this. Cole appeared from somewhere. He had been circling the food situation and had apparently resolved it because he arrived with a bread roll and no visible remorse. And he looked at Ava and said, "You didn't use the pages." "I didn't need them." "I know, I could tell from across the room." He bit the bread roll. "Dad, she didn't use the pages." "I saw that. It was better without them." "Usually is," Mason said. Cole looked between his father and Sienna with the frank assessment of an 8-year-old who has decided something but hasn't decided whether to say it. Then he said to Ava, "Are they always going to be weird about it?" Ava looked at her mother, then at Mason, then back at Cole. "Probably," she said. Cole sighed with the theatrical resignation of someone accepting an inconvenient truth. Okay, he said, and went back toward the food. Later, when the formal portion of the evening had finished, and the room had shifted into the looser, louder register of people who had eaten and drunk and had their emotions moved and were now transitioning back into normal conversation, the 4 of them ended up at a table in the corner. Not by plan, just by the gradual aggregation that happens when people find where they want to be and stay there. Cole was reading the shipwreck book, which he had brought in his jacket pocket in the manner of someone who has learned to always have a contingency. Ava was drawing in the notebook, patterns again, but different from the old ones, more open, less compulsively tight, which her therapist had noted months ago as significant, and which Sienna had noted as Ava having more room inside herself than she'd had before. Mason and Sienna were talking about something low stakes and specific, a staffing decision at the Seattle Center, whether the timeline for the 3rd location in San Francisco was realistic given the current funding picture. And it was the conversation of 2 people who work together and have stopped maintaining the artificial separation between professional and personal, because the work is also the life, and the life is also the work, and the boundary had dissolved somewhere around July, without either of them marking the exact moment. At some point the conversation paused, and they were just sitting at the table in the corner of the room while the gala wound down around them, and Mason looked at the 2 kids across from them, Cole with his book, Ava with her notebook, and then at Sienna. "Rachel would have liked you," he said. "I've thought about that a lot. She would have found you annoying in the specific way she found competent people annoying because she had high standards, but she would have liked you." Sienna looked at him. "Is that a compliment?" "Yeah, it's a high bar." "Okay." She considered it. "My husband, Ava's father, he was the one who made everything feel less serious than it actually was. He was good at that." "I'm not." She paused. "I think he would have been impressed by you and also slightly intimidated, which would have made him funnier than usual, which was already pretty funny." Mason nodded slowly. "What was his name?" "Daniel." She said it simply, without the slight brace she'd developed around the name in the first 2 years, the intake of breath before it. It was just his name now. Daniel Ashford. They sat with that for a moment, not as a weight, but as a presence. The acknowledgement of 2 people who had come to this table by way of losses that were not over, but were no longer the only thing. There was something Sienna had been thinking about for months, something she hadn't said to anyone because she hadn't yet found the version of it that was true, rather than just consoling. She thought about it now, sitting in the corner of this room, watching her daughter draw in the notebook with the open, unhurried hand of someone who had discovered she had more time than she'd thought. The thing she kept thinking was this: none of the breaking had been wasted. Not the crash. Not the 3 years of silence, or the 11 specialists, or the board calls, or the hotel suite that had felt like a holding pattern. Not Mason's 14 years of service, or his wife's death, or the 8 months of pushing equipment around a rehabilitation facility. Not any of it. All of it had been the path to this table, to this program, to 63 patients who had been given a different answer to the question of what was possible for their bodies and their lives. All of it had built towards something that could not have been built any other way, by any other people, coming from any other direction. This was not a comfortable thought, exactly. It didn't resolve the grief. It didn't make the losses smaller. It was just accurate. The way Mason's observations about Ava's nerve signal had been accurate, not because they were hopeful, but because they were real. She had spent 3 years learning to live inside a loss. And then she had spent 1 year learning that the loss was not the end of the story, and that the next chapter had begun in a corridor on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when a girl who hadn't spoken in 3 years looked up at a man with a mop and decided he was different. She had not believed in small moments before that. She had believed in capital, in scale, in the force of concentrated will applied to clearly identified problems. She had been, by those measures, very successful. She believed in small moments now. The room was thinning. The string quartet had packed up. The staff was moving through with quiet efficiency, clearing the remnants of the evening. Cole had finished his bread roll in his chapter and had fallen asleep in the chair in the specific sudden way he had. Vertical one moment, horizontal the next, completely without self-consciousness about it. Ava looked at him. Then she looked at Mason. She held up the notebook. She had drawn something new. Not the geometric patterns, not the closed, repeating structures she'd filled pages with for 3 years. It was a picture, rough but deliberate. 4 figures at a table. A woman and a man on one side, 2 kids across from them. The proportions were approximate and the style was more honest than skilled, and it was unmistakably them. Underneath it, she had written 4 words. This is a family. Mason looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Sienna. She was already looking at him. Yeah, he said. It is. He said it the way he said the things that were true. Without performance, without the architecture of a significant moment, just the plain statement of something he had decided to stop pretending was uncertain. The same 3-word certainty he'd used on the porch in April, the same quality of commitment that came not from the absence of doubt, but from the decision to move anyway. Ava accepted this with a nod, the way she accepted things that confirmed what she had already understood. She closed the notebook. Outside, December had done what December in Portland occasionally did. It had snowed, lightly, the kind of snow that doesn't stick but changes the look of the city for a few hours, makes the familiar strange and quiet in particular. Cole slept. Ava watched the window. Mason and Sienna sat in the corner of the room that was emptying out around them, and they didn't rush, because there was nowhere to be immediately, and because the particular stillness of an evening that has said everything it needed to say is its own kind of rare, and they both understood now what it cost to not recognize that until it was gone. There are things you only learn by losing them first. The value of a voice, the weight of a step, the specific irreplaceable quality of an ordinary evening with people you chose and who chose you back. You can know this abstractly, from the outside. Most people do. But knowing it the way Sienna and Mason knew it, through years of loss, through the work of rebuilding, through the slow and imperfect and genuinely difficult process of deciding to try again, that kind of knowing sits in the body differently. It makes you slower to dismiss the small things, slower to assume there will be another chance at the conversation you keep putting off, the forgiveness you keep not quite offering, the moment you keep almost having. They had both paid for the lesson, and they were both in this room on this December evening, with snow falling outside and 2 kids across the table, and the remnants of a gala that had raised money to help 60 strangers live differently. They were both, by any honest measure, grateful. Not in a clean way. Not in the way of people who have resolved everything and arrived somewhere final. In the messier, realer way of people who are still in the middle of something and know it, and have decided that the middle is not a problem to be solved, but a place to be inhabited, with attention, for as long as they get. That was the whole of it. That had always been the whole of it. Mason reached over and turned Cole's book right side up. It had slid sideways in his sleep, and Ava saw him do it and wrote something in the notebook one more time and showed Sienna. Can we come back next year? Sienna looked at the room, at the space that had held last year's first impossible steps, and this year's honest words and whatever next year would bring, which she didn't know yet, which was fine, which was as it should be. Yes, she said, simple as that. Yes.